The warehouse auction outside Cleveland made the entire crowd laugh the moment a quiet man stepped forward and paid exactly $2,000 for a dust-covered, rust-eaten 1963 coupe that no one else would touch. The young CEO standing nearby announced clearly that he had just bought the most expensive scrap metal in America. But 3 days later, private jets began arriving at a small regional airfield, carrying collectors who had flown through the night just to look at that same car. When a billionaire offered $2 million in cash on the spot, nothing was ever quiet again. But the most frightening part was not the car. It was the reason Connor knew exactly what it was worth. Connor Hayes had spent the last 6 years becoming invisible, and he was good at it. He ran a repair shop out of a rented garage on the eastern edge of Cleveland, a low building with cracked concrete floors, fluorescent lights that buzzed in cold weather, and a hand-painted sign above the door that most people drove past without reading. He took in old vehicles the way some people take in things others have given up on, with patience, without expectation, and with the quiet understanding that broken and worthless are not the same thing. His hands were permanently marked with grease that never fully washed out. His boots were worn through at the left heel, and the truck he drove was old enough that mechanics at dealerships sometimes declined to service it. From the outside, he looked like a man who had settled into a modest, unremarkable life. He had not settled, he was waiting. What the people who hired him to replace timing belts and fix rusted brake lines did not know was that Connor Hayes had once been something else entirely. In his late 20s, he had worked as a drivetrain systems engineer for one of the major American manufacturers in Detroit, not on the floor, but in the technical development division, the kind of work that required reading engineering schematics the way other people read newspapers. He had been genuinely good at it, the kind of good that gets noticed, and that in certain workplaces makes the wrong people uncomfortable. The project he had contributed to most heavily, a load-bearing analysis for a crossover platform that would go on to sell in the hundreds of thousands, was submitted under a different name. His name was not on the report. When he raised the issue quietly through internal channels, he was managed out within 3 months. No hearing, no formal response, no acknowledgement. He packed his tools and drove west. He had not tried to go back, which surprised everyone who heard the story. What they expected was anger or litigation or at minimum a prolonged and visible bitterness. What they got instead was a man who woke early, worked with precision, and spent his evenings in a back room reading technical histories of American automotive development from the post-war decades forward. He had filled 2 full bookshelves with documentation, journals, industry records, photocopied production reports. His particular interest was the early 1960s, the experimental programs that the major manufacturers had launched and quietly buried, programs that had produced vehicles no one was ever meant to see, built to test ideas that the market wasn't ready for. Most of those prototypes were gone. A few existed behind locked doors in private collections. One, according to documents Connor had spent years assembling, had simply disappeared. Madison Clark, meanwhile, had built her reputation on the opposite principle, that the market always revealed what things were worth, and that she understood the market better than anyone else in the room. At 29, she was the chief executive of Clark Heritage Motors, a firm she had grown from a regional auction house into a nationally recognized brand for high-value classic vehicles. She was sharp, well-prepared, and skilled at turning a transaction into a public moment. She understood that the aesthetics of authority mattered as much as the substance of it, and she had built her company accordingly. She was not reckless. She had simply not yet encountered something she didn't know how to categorize. Her director of operations, Sebastian Cole, was already at the Brecker property on the morning of the auction, making sure the day would run as planned. The Brecker Industrial Auction was not a significant event by most measures. Eleanor Brooks, the former owner of the storage complex on the city's south edge, had hired Clark Heritage Motors to liquidate the contents of 3 warehouses before the building was demolished to make way for a freight distribution center. Most of what remained had been sitting untouched for at least 15 years. Pallets of industrial equipment, rusted tool cabinets, 2 decommissioned delivery vehicles from the 1980s. The catalog listed 42 lots, none carrying an estimate above $12,000. Madison had sent Sebastian to oversee the day because the event didn't require her presence, and Sebastian was efficient. He arrived early, walked the lots, confirmed the catalog, and waited for the crowd. Connor had seen the listing 3 days earlier. He had not come for any of the 42 catalog lots. He had come because of a single phrase in the property description: vehicle storage section, contents unknown, sold as found. To most buyers, that language meant broken machinery and unlisted junk. To Connor, it meant something different. He arrived before the crowd, asked one of the warehouse workers where the vehicle section was, and was pointed toward the far end of the third building. The space was dim, overhead lights working but low, the air carrying the particular stillness of a room undisturbed for years. There were 4 vehicles under canvas, 2 panel vans with flat tires, a pickup without a hood, and a shape in the far corner that sat lower and wider than the others. He pulled the canvas back. Beneath it was a 2-door coupe, long in the body, narrow at the roof, built in the proportions of the early 1960s. The paint was nearly gone, consumed by oxidation down to a dull copper gray. The chrome trim was pitted. There were no badges, no manufacturer markings, no logo anywhere on the bodywork, unusual but not immediately alarming. What stopped him was the roofline. The angle was wrong, not in the way of a custom modification, but in the way of something that had never been built to match any production specification. The greenhouse was lower than it should have been. The A-pillars were set at an angle that matched no nameplate from that decade. He crouched beside the front wheel well and checked the gap between the body and the suspension mount. The wheelbase was longer than standard. He checked the other side, same. Then he looked at the seam along the firewall and found the welds, hand-laid, not production welds, the work of a fabricator assembling one car at a time from a design specification in a controlled environment. He stood up, looked at the car for a long moment, and walked back out into the daylight without changing his expression. He found the auction coordinator and confirmed the vehicle section would be an unlisted lot at the end of the day, open bidding, no reserve. Then he found a position near the back of the crowd and waited through 2 hours of industrial equipment, cabinet lots, and decommissioned tooling. When the coupe was brought up, the response was exactly what everyone looking at it expected: silence. Then scattered bids from people who thought they might strip it for parts. The highest competing offer was $800. Connor raised his card and bid $2,000. The room turned toward him. Several people laughed. Madison Clark, standing near the tent at the edge of the lot with Sebastian beside her, looked at the car and then at the man who had just bid on it, and said clearly enough for those nearby to hear that whoever he was, he had just spent $2,000 on something that wasn't worth the tow. The people around her agreed. Connor signed the paperwork, arranged the tow, and left. Word traveled the way it always does in small auction circles, quickly, through people with nothing more interesting to discuss, gaining detail and losing context as it moved. By the following morning, the story in circulation was consistent. A man no one knew had paid $2,000 for an unsalvageable coupe at a demolition lot auction where the best items had been tool cabinets and a working pallet jack. Someone described it as watching a person spend their rent money on a broken television at a yard sale and call it a sound decision. Clark Heritage's communications team put out a brief public statement that afternoon summarizing the day's results, highlighting the notable lots, and noting in one line that an off-catalog vehicle had found an enthusiastic buyer despite its condition. The phrase used was most expensive scrap metal in Cleveland. Madison had intended it as an honest market observation. The people who read it and recognized who it referred to received it as something sharper. Connor's name was not mentioned directly, but the collector and restoration community in the Cleveland area was small enough that the reference was clear. Sebastian stopped by the garage 2 days after the auction without calling ahead. He stood in the doorway, looked at the coupe sitting under the work light, and made a series of observations about the paint, about the missing badges, about whether Connor had considered that $2,000 was a recoverable number only if the car contained something no one had yet identified, which in his professional opinion it did not. He asked if Connor had thought through what he was actually dealing with. Connor, crouched beside the rear quarter panel with a drop light, did not look up. He said he appreciated the visit. Sebastian waited. Nothing else came. He left. What happened in the garage that night, and for the 2 nights following, was not visible to anyone who wasn't inside it. Connor worked without rushing. He removed the canvas that had protected the rear compartment. He cleaned the passenger floor with a dry brush. He located the area where a data plate should have been. It had been removed, which was itself information, and moved on. He took the drop light under the car and examined the frame rails. The stampings were there, partial, surface rusted, but present. He photographed each one. Then he read the number sequence against a document he had kept in his filing cabinet for 11 years, compared what he found to a partial production record from a program a manufacturer had listed as fully decommissioned and physically destroyed, and the comparison held. He went to the engine compartment and began removing the cover. The name Project Ether had appeared in exactly 2 documents Connor had ever located that referenced it directly. The first was a decommissioned internal memo from a Detroit area manufacturer, dated 1962, describing a closed experimental program to develop a prototype powertrain architecture operating entirely outside the standard production pipeline. The program had no public announcement, no trade presence, and no marketing identity. 3 vehicles had been constructed to test the powertrain in a real chassis environment. The memo called them evaluation units, not production candidates. It stated that the program would be discontinued after the 3rd evaluation phase and that all 3 units would be disposed of under standard decommission protocol. The second document was personal, a letter never mailed, written by a man named Harold Greer, a fabrication specialist at the facility where the 3 vehicles had been assembled. Connor had found it inside a box of personal correspondence at an estate auction in Michigan 8 years earlier, catalogued as no monetary value, purchased by no one. He had paid $4 for it. Greer described his understanding that 2 of the 3 evaluation units had been crushed according to the decommission order. The 3rd, he wrote, had been removed from the facility by a senior program engineer before the destruction order was executed. Where it went, he did not know. He suspected it had been stored. He died in 1987, and nothing about him or the program had ever entered public record. Connor had treated that information as background for years, something worth carrying, something that might or might not resolve into anything tangible. The auction listing had changed that. He drove to the county records office and filed a formal request for the full title history of the Brecker property. The clerk found it after 3 days and a written application. The property had been purchased in 1968 by a holding company whose registered agent matched a logistics firm that, according to a trade directory from that decade, had provided warehousing services to several large manufacturing clients in the region. The purchase date was 5 years after the decommission order described in the Ether memo, long enough for a vehicle to have been moved, stored quietly, and forgotten by everyone except the person who had arranged the storage. Connor wrote the logistics firm name down and kept going. He traced it to its parent company, found the parent company's client list from its operating period in the early to mid-1960s, and found one name that matched the manufacturer named in the Ether memo. He drove to the Detroit Public Library's technical collection and spent 2 days in the microfilm archive working through industry directories and corporate filings from the target period. The chain was fragmentary but consistent. Each link pointed the same direction. He called Walter Sims, a retired engineer in his mid-80s who lived outside Ann Arbor, whom Connor had spoken to once briefly at an industry gathering nearly a decade earlier. Walter answered on the 4th ring. Connor explained what he had found. There was a long silence. Then Walter said he had heard the name Ether once, in passing, from a colleague no longer living, and that in his experience people who had worked on programs like that had been quietly encouraged not to discuss them. Then he said something useful, that if Connor had found what he thought he had, the one thing that couldn't be moved between vehicles or fabricated after the fact was the secondary casting identification on the engine block, a location used only in prototype fabrication to distinguish experimental units from standard development vehicles. He described exactly where to look. Connor thanked him, returned to the garage, and spent 3 hours cleaning the block section by section with a solvent rag and a soft brass brush until the original casting marks were fully visible. He found the number where Walter had described. He photographed it under 3 different lighting conditions. He cross-referenced it against the frame data and the number sequence in the Greer letter. The sequences were consistent across all three sources. He set the camera down on the workbench, looked at the engine for a moment, and thought about a $4 box of letters, an 11-year filing cabinet, and $2,000 bid in front of a laughing crowd. Then he went back to work. He posted one photograph to a private collector forum, a closed technical group of fewer than 200 vetted members. The image showed a 40 square centimeter section of the engine block casting face, focused on the identification number, with surrounding metal visible for context. No description, no claim, no background. One line only: anyone who recognizes this architecture, please contact me directly. By the following morning, he had 11 private messages. By the afternoon, 23. Several came from collectors he recognized by reputation, serious people, not enthusiasts. The kind who held climate-controlled storage in European cities and crossed continents for closed evaluations of significant objects. 2 came from automotive historians with university affiliations. 1 came from a Japanese collector who had spent 30 years documenting American experimental programs from the post-war decades and who wrote, in formal and precise English, that if Connor's image was accurate and unmanipulated, it represented something a significant number of people in his field had long believed was permanently lost. 3 days after the post, Gabriel Turner flew into Cleveland on a private aircraft and arrived at the garage unannounced, accompanied only by a personal assistant who waited outside in a rented car and did not come in. Gabriel was 58, built like someone who had once been physically strong and never entirely lost it, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of a man who had spent 4 decades in rooms where the objects were worth more than most buildings. He had begun collecting in his 30s with production classics and moved gradually toward vehicles that existed in single digits, cars that had survived not because they were common but because circumstance, luck, and deliberate human decision had kept them from being destroyed. He walked around the coupe once without touching it. Then he crouched by the front suspension and looked at the mounting geometry. He stood, moved to the engine compartment, and examined the block for a long time without speaking. Then he turned and looked at Connor. He said he had been aware of ether since the early 1990s, that he had spent significant money over 2 decades trying to determine whether any evaluation unit had survived, and that approximately 8 years ago he had concluded they had not. He asked where the car had come from and how Connor had known what it was. Connor answered the first question directly. A warehouse demolition auction, South Cleveland. Off catalog lot, $2,000. He answered the second by pointing at the filing cabinet and saying he had been reading for 11 years. Gabriel looked at the cabinet, then at Connor, and nodded as though that answer made more sense to him than a simpler one would have. Then he named a figure, $600,000, transferable within 24 hours. Connor said he appreciated the offer and was not ready to sell. Gabriel said that was a notable decision and that he respected it. He shook Connor's hand, left a card with a personal number, and left. Connor stood in the doorway and watched the car drive away. The number Gabriel had named, more than he had earned in the last 6 years combined, had not moved him. He went inside, added a note to the folder, and thought about what Walter Sims had said about the engine block. Madison heard about Gabriel Turner's visit the way she heard about most things in the collector market. Quickly from multiple directions, with enough corroborating detail that dismissal was not an option. Gabriel Turner did not travel to look at cars casually. In the past 2 years he had not left his home country for any auction, viewing, or professional engagement she was aware of. The fact that he had flown directly to a garage on the outer edge of Cleveland to look at a car company had sold at a demolition auction for $2,000 was information that required her to sit down and reconsider a sequence of events she had already classified as closed. She pulled the Brecker auction file. The vehicle section had been listed as an off-catalog edition. No reserve, no inspection report, sold as fact. There had been no internal evaluation before the auction date. The building was scheduled for demolition, the timeline was compressed, and Sebastian had made the operational call to list the vehicle section without a formal appraisal. She read that decision again. Then she asked her research director to compile everything publicly available on American experimental automotive programs from the late 1950s and early 1960s. The summary came back the following day. Near the end of a section on discontinued manufacturer programs, her director had included a reference to an internal development project that had never entered public documentation. The name was Ether. The notes described a closed powertrain experiment, 3 evaluation vehicles, and an official decommission record indicating all units had been destroyed. Her director had added a line at the bottom, information fragmentary. No surviving physical evidence ever authenticated. Madison read that last line several times. Xavier Reed published a short professional statement that week, not a formal appraisal, but a declaration of professional interest, and the industry read those carefully because Reed's opinions had a documented effect on prices. He stated only that if early reports were accurate, the value of the object in question would not be measured in hundreds of thousands. It would be measured in multiples of millions, and the upper range would depend on provenance documentation. Several publications ran careful pieces in response, not confirming, not dismissing, and each of them included the same underlying fact in some form. The vehicle had been sold at a Clark Heritage Motors auction for $2,000. Most reproduced Madison's public statement. One ran it in enlarged type. Sebastian came to her office and explained that Connor Hayes had clearly pursued the vehicle with prior knowledge, that he had deliberately concealed its significance to acquire it at below market cost, and that Clark Heritage's failure to identify it resulted from incomplete documentation and unusual circumstances rather than professional error. Madison listened to the whole explanation. Then she asked how Connor had known what the vehicle was. Sebastian said he believed Connor had made an educated inference and been unusually fortunate. Madison looked at him for a long moment and did not respond. What she was working through privately was something that framing couldn't accommodate. A man who ran a small repair operation in a building she wouldn't have noticed driving past, who wore clothing suggesting he hadn't purchased anything new in years, who had stood in a crowd of people laughing at him and bid without visible reaction, had done so with the certainty of someone who had been working toward a specific conclusion for a very long time. That was not luck. She did not say that to Sebastian. But she thought about it for the rest of the day. The appraisal session was not announced publicly in advance. Connor contacted 6 people directly. Gabriel Turner, Xavier Reed, 2 automotive historians with academic affiliations, a metallurgical analyst who specialized in post-war American industrial casting, and a university archivist whose collection held original manufacturer documentation from the 1940s through the 70s. Each received a direct message with a time, a date, an address, and one sentence. "I have something I believe is worth your time to examine in person," all 6 confirmed. The garage had been prepared with the thoroughness of someone who understood the stakes and felt no need for presentation. The coupe sat at the center of the floor under full lighting, every accessible panel cleaned, every surface visible. The engine compartment was open. The undercarriage was elevated on floor stands so the frame rails could be examined without obstruction. On a work table against the wall, Connor had arranged the documents in chronological sequence. The 1962 memo with the archive certification stamp, the Greer letter with its authentication record, the title chain from the county records office, the production cross-references from the Detroit archive, and the identification number comparisons between the frame, the body stampings, and the engine block. Nothing hidden, nothing dramatic. Laid out the way a technical case is laid out, in order for examination. More people had arrived than Connor had originally invited. Word had spread through the collector community in the days following Gabriel Turner's visit, and by the time the session began the space was fuller than 6 chairs would have suggested. People along the walls, several in the doorway. Madison Clark was near the back, alone, without anyone she had come with. Sebastian was not present. Xavier Reed worked through the vehicle methodically, starting from the exterior and working inward, spending nearly 40 minutes on the engine block with equipment from a black case. He photographed the casting marks from multiple angles and cross-referenced them against documentation from his own archive on a tablet. The metallurgical analyst took surface samples from the block face and one section of the frame rail for laboratory testing. The archivist examined the worktable documents and confirmed 2 reference items against materials he had brought from his own collection. Gabriel stood to one side throughout and watched. He had already seen what he needed to see. He was there for the confirmation. The room was quiet in the particular way of people concentrating, focused, moving carefully around the car, speaking in low voices when they spoke at all. Connor remained at the perimeter, answered questions when asked, located documents when requested, and otherwise did not insert himself. He did not appear anxious. He appeared like someone present at the resolution of a long piece of work. When Xavier Reed finished and stood at the center of the floor, the room settled without anyone calling for quiet. He looked at his notes briefly. Then he addressed the room without preamble. The vehicle was genuine. He said the engine block identification number was consistent with the internal records from the discontinued program, and that the casting metallurgy aligned with prototype fabrication practices from the target decade rather than later production methods. He said the body architecture, wheelbase, a pillar geometry, firewall construction, suspension mounting did not match any known production vehicle from any American manufacturer in that period. He said the physical evidence and the documentation record together supported a single conclusion. This was a surviving evaluation unit from a closed experimental program, never publicly authenticated, never documented as existing. He paused. Then he said he believed it to be the only one of its kind remaining in existence. The room went very still, not silence exactly, but the sudden absence of background movement, breath held without intention. Madison felt something settle in her chest that was not guilt precisely, but a recognition with weight behind it that had arrived too late to be useful. Gabriel Turner looked at the coupe with an expression different from the one he had worn on his first visit. Then the collectors in the room began speaking with the compressed urgency of people recalibrating the value of an object very quickly. Numbers moved openly through the space: 800,000, 1,200,000, 1,500,000, stated by a collector from the Pacific Northwest, with the directness of someone who had already resolved his own hesitation. Then a representative near the side wall, there on behalf of a principal who was not present, stated a number clearly enough for the whole room to hear. $2 million, transferable by wire within one business day, subject only to written title transfer. The room did not erupt. It went the other direction, dense, heavy, quiet in a way that was louder than noise. Madison Clark stood at the back and looked at Connor Hayes, who had not changed his expression at all. What most of the people in that garage did not know was the full shape of Connor Hayes before he became the man who repaired cars in a rented building on the east side of Cleveland. He had come through a university engineering program in Michigan with the kind of technical intuition that formal training produces only when it finds something that was already there, an ability to read a drivetrain stress analysis the way a musician reads rhythm, recognizing failure patterns before they appeared in test data. He had been recruited into Detroit before he finished his degree. The people who worked with him in those early years used the specific language professionals use when they mean something is genuine and not inflated. Precise, unusually fast at diagnosis, capable of identifying systemic failure points in complex mechanical systems before the failure materialized. The work that ended his time there was a torque distribution analysis for a crossover platform, a load-bearing inconsistency in the transfer case mounting geometry that, under sustained high-load conditions, would have produced audible vibration and, over time, structural fatigue in the secondary frame member. He found it, documented it, proposed the correction, and submitted it through the internal review process. The correction was adopted, the platform launched successfully. The analysis was published internally under the name of the division chief who had supervised the project. Connor raised the attribution issue. He was told that individual contributions to collaborative development work were not separately tracked under the company's intellectual property agreement and that his contract was written broadly enough to cover the work in question. 6 weeks later, his contract was not renewed. He consulted a lawyer and was told the challenge would be expensive and unlikely to succeed. He thanked the lawyer, paid the fee, and drove back to Cleveland. The research into lost programs had started as something to occupy the evenings and deepened over years into a sustained, documented belief that at least one vehicle from at least one of those programs had not been destroyed as the official record stated, and that the evidence to locate it existed somewhere, waiting for the person who had assembled enough of the surrounding context to recognize what they were looking at. He had not known when that would happen. Then a demolition catalog had included 2 words in an unlisted property description, and he had driven to a South Side warehouse and found a shape under a canvas. Madison had assembled most of this from the commentary published in the preceding week. What she hadn't been prepared for was the full weight of the implications, not the biographical details themselves, but what they said about the afternoon of the auction. She had looked at the worn jacket, the old truck, the $2,000 bid, and made a determination without examining the underlying information. That was the error. It was not complicated and it was not deniable, and it was exactly the kind of error she would have caught immediately if someone else had made it. In front of her, the $2 million offer did not close on the day it was made. Connor received the written terms, read them fully, and said he would respond within 48 hours. The collectors in the room received that as a formality. A number that size from a party with that standing was expected to resolve in one direction. Sebastian Cole understood the situation differently. He contacted a journalist who covered the collector market with a sensational orientation and provided a framing, not a direct accusation, but a carefully shaped question about whether the provenance chain for the alleged ether vehicle had been fully verified before the value conversation had been allowed to escalate. He described himself as a company insider and suggested that some of the documentation Connor had presented had moved very quickly from private to publicly claimed without independent confirmation. The journalist published a short piece the following morning that used the word unverified 3 times in 4 paragraphs. Connor read it at 6 in the morning. He called Gabriel Turner on the second ring. He said he was organizing an open verification session in 48 hours and wanted the archivist and the metallurgical analyst present. Gabriel said he would be there. The session took place in the same garage, with more people than the first. Connor worked through the provenance chain piece by piece without commentary in order. The 1962 memo obtained through a formal records access request, stamped with the archive's certification. The Greer letter, reviewed by a document authentication specialist and confirmed consistent with materials from the late 1960s in paper composition and ink chemistry. The title chain from the county records office, the metallurgical analysis results, returned from the laboratory that morning, confirming that the engine block alloy composition matched industrial casting standards documented for prototype fabrication from the relevant period. The identification number cross-references between frame, body stampings, and block. Then he opened a second folder he had not presented at the first session. Inside were 5 pages. Original blueprint sections from the experimental program, sourced from a private historical archive holding the estate papers of a deceased engineer who had worked on the program. Connor had filed the research access request 2 years earlier and waded through the processing period. The blueprints showed the body architecture, the wheelbase specification, the A-pillar geometry, and the engine compartment layout. Every measurable dimension matched the vehicle on the floor. He also presented a signed declaration from Walter Sims, the retired engineer in Ann Arbor, attesting to his knowledge of the Ether program's operational history and confirming the existence of a third evaluation unit removed from the facility before the decommission order was executed. Walter had agreed to sign when Connor called him the morning after the journalist's piece appeared. The archivist confirmed the blueprint provenance. The metallurgical analyst restated his laboratory results verbally. Xavier Reed, who had returned for the second session, said the combined documentation record was the most complete provenance chain he had personally reviewed for a vehicle of this category in his career. Sebastian had not come. Madison came alone. After the formal review concluded and the room had settled into individual conversations, she crossed the floor and stood in front of Connor. She was not composed in her usual way. She said she owed him a direct apology, that the comment at the auction, and the way she had allowed it to carry publicly, had been careless and wrong, and that carelessness was not a defense. She said she had looked at the surface of the situation and made a public call without understanding what she was looking at, and she was sorry for the substance of it and for the fact that it had been public. She said it clearly, without softening it into something more comfortable. Connor listened. He said he appreciated it. He did not expand the moment or diminish it. He received the apology as what it was, a professional acknowledgement between 2 people who had stood at the same auction and read the Same object in entirely different ways. 2 days later, he signed the transfer agreement. The final sale figure was $2,140,000. The title transferred without dispute. The buyer's logistics team arranged transport through a specialist firm, and the coupe left the garage on a closed trailer on a gray Tuesday morning. Connor watched it go from the doorway. What the buyer's representative had reviewed and accepted in the agreement, what everyone in the room had understood as a standard technical clarification in the contract language, was a single exemption clause. The vehicle was being transferred without powertrain. The engine block remained with the seller. Before the signing, Xavier Reed had pulled Connor aside and said quietly that the prototype engine, unmodified, in its current condition, without a documented market comparator, represented a category of object whose value would not be established by any conventional auction process. He said a serious collector with the right orientation and enough time would pay more for the engine than had been offered for the car. Connor said he thought that was probably right. Then he signed the agreement for $2,140,000 and kept the engine. The representative's principal had accepted those terms. No one in the room at the moment of signing had said anything further about the engine. Gabriel Turner, standing near the door as the papers were exchanged, looked at Connor once before he left, a look that lasted a moment longer than was casual, carrying something between recognition and a reassessment he hadn't finished yet. In the months that followed, the story moved the way these things do, first through the narrow channels of the collector and restoration community, then outward, picked up by engineering and business publications interested less in the car itself than in what the surrounding events implied. A man with deep technical knowledge, no institutional affiliation, and a decade of documented research had identified a significant object in a setting where credentialed professionals had looked and found nothing. The publications drew different conclusions depending on their orientation, but they converged on the basic shape of it. Expertise is not the same as credential, and the most dangerous person in any transaction is the one who has done the work that everyone else assumed wasn't necessary. Connor used a portion of the proceeds to purchase the building and expand it into a proper restoration facility. He upgraded the lighting, installed a second lift, and added a climate-controlled section for documentation and significant components. Within the first year, 3 manufacturers and 1 major private collection had contacted him for consulting work on vehicles with undocumented engineering anomalies, the specific combination of formal training, sustained historical research that turned out, in practice, to be genuinely rare. He took the work that interested him and declined what didn't. He was not in a hurry. Madison Clark restructured the pre-auction evaluation process at Clark Heritage Motors. She brought in 2 additional specialists with technical engineering backgrounds for vehicle assessment, mandated a formal inspection step for any lot that arrived with incomplete seller documentation, and introduced a mandatory documentation review for any lot carrying an unknown contents designation before it was listed for public bidding. She did not publicize these changes as a response to the Brecker auction. The people who worked in the industry understood the connection without being told. Gabriel Turner remained in contact with Connor. He had not succeeded in purchasing the car, but he respected the process and the outcome. He said once, after the sale had closed, that in his experience the most instructive moment in any transaction was rarely the final number. It was usually the person who had done the work before the transaction started that no one else in the room had thought to do. Connor was in the garage the morning after the closing, standing near the work table where the engine block sat under clean, even light. The casting marks on the block face were clearly visible from where he stood. The identification number, the secondary fabrication stamp, the small physical record of a program that had tried to disappear 60 years ago and hadn't quite managed it. The block was not for sale, had never been for sale, and would not be until Connor decided the time and the buyer were right, decisions he had not begun to make. He looked at it for a moment, the way a person looks at something they have spent a long time finding and are in no particular rush to relinquish. Then he picked up his tools and went to work.